Welcome, everybody. My name is Alaric Shear, or Alaric Jackson, if you want to call me. Today, I'm going to be talking about Greek literature. Now, Greek literature is super incredible. It's amazing. It's beloved because it has influenced many over the centuries. Greek writers are responsible for the introduction of genres such as poetry, tragedy, and comedy, and even Western philosophy. And included in this is their rich history of both war and peace. Now, we might be asked, what kind of um, things were they dealing with, living with in their time? We can say, for example, they were dealing with war. Sometimes they were dealing with peace. Most common war was the Trojan War. Everybody knows about that from the Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. And some people don't think it existed. It's possible that it did, but they lived a lot of that. Some people lived during reigns of terrible leaders and stuff like that. So there's a lot to Greek literature that is just incredible. Now, the genres in Greek literature were epic poetry, lyric poetry, and theater. In Greek epic poetry, like the Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, they were classics, and they in their genre, and they're epics because they sing of the exploits of Greek heroes. Lyric poetry has sentimental, emotional themes. These could be performed by a soloist or by a choir. Representatives of this genre are Anacreontic, Sappho, and Pandaren. Now, theater had two dramatic works, comedies and tragedies. Through this genre, it was thought that the person listening to it could reflect and have fun with common life events and with the virtues and vices of man in front of his destiny. Such themes, such as oral epics to histories from the philosophies, can be divided into three distinct periods. Now, and then the in between these three periods, we also have another one, the Greco-Roman, which was added to the Hellenistic. So we have the archaic, classical, and the Hellenistic or Greco-Roman. It's just like from the Hellenistic, it moved from the Greco-Roman when um, a lot of people were talking about Greek literature in the Roman world. Now, archaic literature focused much on myth, which was where we mix history with folklore. For example, Homer's epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and even Hesiod's Theogony, are especially important for this time period. Hesiod is extremely important because he is considered the father of Greek didactic poetry. But Homer is where literary Greek began, and that can be contributed to the fact that before Homer, writing had not arrived to Greece, and most of what was created was orally communicated. The classical era, though, which was between the 4th and 15th century before Christ, centered on famous tragedies such as Oedipus Rex by Sophocles or Euripides' Hippolytus and the comedies of Aristophanes. The Hellenistic era, which was included poetry, prose, and the culture influenced writers such as Horace, Ovid, and Virgil. These three writers are Roman. During the Archaic period, all the works were spoken normally at festivals, and this work was mostly produced out of Greek Dark Ages, or Greek's Dark Ages. For example, um, Homer's The Iliad was centered on the last days of the Trojan War, which was initiated by the love of a beautiful woman named Helen. This epic introduced us to Achilles, Hector, and even Paris. It contrasted many subjects like gods and mortals, divine and human, or even war and peace. It is also said that Alexander the Great would sleep with a copy of this book under his pillow, and he also believed he was a relative to Achilles. The Odyssey, which was his second work, the work of Homer, revolved around the 10-year odyssey of the Trojan war hero Odysseus and his fight to get home. Homer's work would actually influence the Roman author Virgil in his work, the Aeneid. Some other authors include Aesop and his fables, who is considered to be the greatest fabulist of his time. Also Sappho, who is considered the 10th muse, and her poems were hymns to the gods and influenced such Roman poets as Horace, Catullus, and Ovid. Most of Aesop's fables ended with a moral such as honesty is the best policy, look before you leap, heaven helps those who help themselves, etc. Hesiod was the hit author of the Theogony, which was a hymn to Apollo's muses. The story told the origins and the genealogies of the gods. His other works also include Working Days, The Shield of Heracles, and Catalog of Women. During the classical period, oral recitation of poetry as well as lyric poetry would morph into drama. But the purpose of drama was not to only entertain, but to also educate. Plays were usually performed in outdoor theaters and were usually part of a religious festival. With those religious festivals, choir singers would explain the action along with actors who were normally in threes wearing masks. There are three complete plays. So Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. So these were three writers who wrote plays. Aeschylus was born in Eleusis around 525 BC and fought at the Battle of Marathon against Persian invaders. His surviving works were the Persians, Seven Against Thieves, Suppliants, and Prometheus, Bound, Aristia, and even Agamemnon, most of which were centered on Greek myth that portrayed the suffering of man and the justice of the gods. He is the first to have a dialogue between the characters. The second is Sophocles, who was the second of the great tragic playwrights. Of his 120 plays, only 21, so he was not the best. And only 3 of his surviving plays are complete. He wrote Oedipus Rex, Antigone, Oedipus at Colonus. The tragedy of Oedipus centered on a prophecy that foretold of a man who would kill his father, the king, and marry his mother. But however, the tragedy of the play is not the murder of his father and the marriage of his mother, but rather that he found out about it. Really weird. Oedipus did not care about killing his father. He did not care about marrying his mother. It just mattered the most about him understanding the prophecy. You know, the last great author of Greek tragedy was Euripides, who was an Athenian. His plays, even though based on plays, were not very successful, and it was believed he was very bitter about his losses. He authored 90 plays. Amongst these were Hippolytus, Trojan Women, and even Orestes. Euripides was known for introducing a second act to his plays, which were concerned with kings and rulers, as well as disputes and dilemmas. His play Medea speaks of a bitter woman who took revenge against her husband by killing her children. Interesting story, no? Aristophanes was the Athenian author of Greek comedy. His plays were satires of public persons and affairs, as well as candid political criticism. 11 of his plays survived, along with 32 titles and fragments of others. These include Knights, Lysistrata, Demophoresusai, The Frogs, and The Clouds. And The Clouds actually ridiculed the philosopher Socrates as a corrupt teacher of rhetoric. So he knew about Socrates. If you ever read about Socrates, you would know that Socrates was a very interesting man. He went around questioning people's logic by asking them simple questions. Amongst great authors were also philosophers and historians who made up Greek thought. Plato, Aristotle, Epictetus, and Epicurus. Plato, being one of the most influential Greek philosophers, was a student of Socrates. His early works were attributed to the life and death of his mentors, such as Apology, Crito, and even Phaedo. His work Symposium was a series of speeches at a dinner party, but his most famous work was The Republic. I've actually read The Republic, had a class on The Republic, and it's a super interesting book. The book is on the nature and the value of justice. It's true. Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, didn't believe in the concept of empiricism as Plato did. He went on to write many works such as Nicomachean Ethics, Physics, and Poetics. He was also the creator of syllogism and a teacher of Alexander the Great. The last grade of contributors were the historians such as Herodotus, Thucydides, and Polybius. Herodotus and Thucydides wrote around the Peloponnesian Wars. Herodotus wrote on both wars between Athens and neighboring Sparta, as well as the Persian Wars. But he is criticized for factual errors, and his accounts relied on earlier works and documents. His narratives demonstrated an understanding of human experiences, and he did not judge like other authors. Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, even though it wasn't complete. Part of his history was written as it happened and looked at both long-range and short-range causes of the war. But his unfinished work would be completed by Xenophon and Cratippus. Now the next to the last era, because we had the Hellenistic, then we had the Greco-Roman. The Hellenistic period produced poets, prose writers, and even historians such as Callimachus, Theocritus, Apollonius Rhodius, and even Plutarch. But much like before that had been written remains in fragments. The poet Callimachus served as a librarian under Ptolemy II and III and wrote over 800 works. His most famous work, Atheia, which means causes, reveals his fascinations of the Greek past, and it concentrated on many of the ancient myths as well as the occult and festivals. His work heavily influenced the poetry of Catullus and Ovid's Metamorphoses. Theocritus wrote many works, but only 30 poems and 24 epigrams is said to be the originator of pastoral poetry. So he wrote 30 poems and also 24 epigrams. And he's also the originator of pastoral poetry. And he would go on to influence the Roman authors such as Ovid. Apollonius Rhodius was a librarian and a tutor. His major work was the 4 books of the Argonautica, which was a retelling of the story of Jason's travel to retrieve the fabled golden fleece. He was able to influence Catullus and Virgil. Menander was a student of philosopher and leading proponent of new comedy. And he went on to author over 100 plays, which included Diosculus, Perichaeromene, and Epitrepontes. He was also known as the master of suspense, and his works were later adapted by the Roman authors Plautus and Terence. This period was also able to produce some notable historians as well. For example, Polybius was a Greek who wrote on Rome's rise to power and was a prominent of Greek culture in Rome. Of his histories, only the first 5 books of the 40 were written, or only 5 of the 40 written existed today. Now, Plutarch was one of the most famous of the Greek histories. He was a philosopher, teacher, and biographer. He could later serve as a priest at the Oracle of Delphi. His most famous work, Parallel Lives, which provided biographies of Roman statesmen, as well as such as Greeks as Alexander, Lycurgus, Themistocles, and Pericles. He chose not to write a continuous history, but concentrated on the personal character of the individual. He also would write on ethical, religious, and political, and even literary topics of the day. Just as the aesthetics and arts of the West originated in classical Greek, Greek literature gave rise to the great ideas of humanity and the questions of man and the role he plays in the world, life, death, and its virtues and its vices, its pleasures and its torments. So Greek literature is super interesting because it influenced so much of the world today. When the authors were writing, they were talking about wars, they were talking about peace, they were talking about the gods. They focused a lot on the gods, biographies of the gods. They talked about the Trojan War, the Peloponnesian War. They talked about so many wars and a lot of peace that went on. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope next time you can join me again to talk about another subject that we would have later on. God bless and have a good day.